Today's lesson is War in Ukraine, 1 year on. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And I'm Candice.
And today we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine, which we've all heard about for a year now. You may not believe it, but the war has been going on for about a year now, give or take a couple of weeks. And indeed, it has been in the news all the time. So, yeah, we're going to try to give you an update as to what's going on there in Ukraine.
Well, lots of people have been suffering and been displaced by the war in Ukraine. And, of course, we call it a war. But in Russia, depending on who you listen to, it's not necessarily referred to as a war. And the coming paragraph explains a little bit more about that.
Right. Different countries have different terminology for their military actions. Like during the Vietnam War, the U.S. referred to it as a police action, at least for a while there, and not an actual war or invasion. But we are talking about the war in Ukraine 1 year on, 1 year after it started. So let's find out about what's going on in Ukraine. Let's listen to the first part of our lesson, and then we'll discuss it.
War in Ukraine, 1 year on. A war that Russia's President Vladimir Putin dubbed a special military operation has now dragged on for almost a year. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, aiming to conquer a country Putin has long viewed as rightfully part of Russia. Believing Ukraine had neither the will nor the weapons to fight back effectively, Putin thought that the invasion would be successfully completed within weeks.
大家好，第一部分我们可以看到动词 invade 指的是武装入侵、侵略或是涌入。举例来说 ，The movie is about little blue men from Jupiter who invade Earth。这部电影是关于来自木星的小蓝人入侵地球的故事。或者 The king invaded a neighboring country to steal its resources。该国王入侵邻国以窃取他的资源。另外补充这个字的名词 invasion。invasion, invasion， 它的意思是入侵或是涌入。像是 My home had an invasion of ants last weekend。 我家上周末有蚂蚁入侵。又或者是 Every summer, the small island experiences an invasion of tourists。 每年夏天，该座小岛都历经观光客的涌入。
Okay, so you all know that the war in Ukraine is between Ukraine and Russia, and a war that Russia's President Vladimir Putin dubbed a special military operation has now dragged on for almost a year. So if you dub something a special way, that means that's what you call it, especially if you give it special terminology. And, of course, Putin has dubbed this war as a special military operation. He does not call it a war, but other people do call it a war. But it's been going on for a long time. It just keeps going on and on and on. That's why we say it has dragged on for so long. It seems like it's never going to get over.
Yes, technically speaking, 1 year isn't that long, but when we think about what people were saying, they said, oh, this war is going to be over in a few weeks. Compared to a few weeks, a year is a really long time. And the fact that Putin has dubbed this a special military operation rather euphemistically also indicates the kind of message that he is spreading back in Russia. But most of the allies of Ukraine recognize it for what it is, a war, because Russia invaded a sovereign country.
Indeed, and of course, a lot of people thought it would be over quickly. It's going to be over in a couple of days. And Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, 1 year ago, aiming to conquer a country Putin has long viewed as rightfully part of Russia. So to invade just means to go from one place to another with an army and take over that other country. And of course, human history is full of countries invading other countries. They take over the other country army and they destroy the government and they are the new government.
Yes, and I think part of the reason that Putin dubs this a special military operation and views Ukraine as part of Russia is because historically Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So he's a little bit stuck in the past and he wants to go back to the glory days of the past. And of course, this invasion is a military action, but I think most of the politicians are trying very hard to make it clear that Ukraine is no longer part of the Soviet Union or the historical Russia. The maps have been redrawn for a very long time, and Russia therefore does not have any right to own any part of the Ukraine.
And also in this sentence, we have the word conquer, which means to take over another country. To invade is the action of moving your army into that country, and then when you have controlled the whole country, we say you have conquered that country. I think the Normans conquered England a long time ago. They just invaded and took over, and they changed a lot of things in England as a result of that. And so here, of course, Putin wants to conquer Ukraine because, hey, it's actually part of our country anyway. So it's not really an invasion. We're just kind of doing this special military operation in our own country. Believing Ukraine had neither the will nor the weapons to fight back effectively, Putin thought that the invasion would be successfully completed within weeks. So, of course, Putin thought Ukraine was just this weak little country with a bunch of sunflowers and nothing else. So he thought, oh, it'll be really easy to take them over because they don't have the will nor the weapons to fight back. They're just really weak people. They don't have a lot of weapons. And, of course, if we invade, they'll welcome us with open arms. Oh, we can be part of Russia? That's wonderful. Please come in. That's what Putin thought, that it would be a cakewalk to go over there into Ukraine. But he found out that it wasn't so easy.
Yes, he vastly underestimated the determination or the will of the Ukrainians to be autonomous, to have their own country. And he also underestimated the international response to his incursion into the Ukraine. Now it's time to listen to the second part, and then we'll discuss it.
Instead, he has seen the full force of Ukraine's determination, as Ukraine has repelled the Russian military and consolidated support from around the world. Even as the Russian army occupied territory in eastern Ukraine, illegally annexing several regions, Ukraine launched successful counteroffensives. Russian troops suffered heavy losses and were humiliated in April by the sinking of the cruiser the Moskva.
第二部分我们看到名词 determination， 它的意思是决心、坚决或是果断。例如 What sets Amanda apart from her friends is her determination to succeed. 使 Amanda 与她朋友不同的是她想要成功的决心。又或者说 Sometimes determination is more important than talent. 有时候决心比才华更重要。另外这个字去掉字尾 ation 再加上 e就会变成动词 determine， 意思是判定、测定或是决定。我们可以说 Your height determines whether you can go on this ride. 你的身高决定你是否能玩这个游乐设施。也可以说 The order of speeches was determined by the speaker's surnames. 演讲的顺序是由讲者的姓氏来决定。再来我们看到单字 occupy， 它是动词，指的是占领、占据或是占时间或是空间。举例来说 Foreign troops occupied several towns near the border. 外国军队占领了边界附近好几个城镇。也可以说 Lucy's toys occupy most of the shelves in her bedroom. Lucy 的玩具占据了她房间内的大部分架子。
Okay, let's discuss the second part of our lesson for today. Remember, at the end of the first part, it said, Putin thought that the invasion would be successfully completed within weeks and Ukraine would be conquered by Russia. But here in the second part, it says, instead, he has seen the full force of Ukraine's determination as Ukraine has repelled the Russian military and consolidated support from around the world. So, of course, he underestimated Ukraine's determination. That means they are intending to do something. They're not going to change their minds. They have this determination, and they're not going to be persuaded to do anything else. They just won't give up, basically. So, yes, indeed, he has seen the full force of Ukraine's determination and their will and their willpower. And, well, Ukraine has repelled the Russian military. If you repel something, you kind of keep it away from you. You push it away. Like if you're outside having a picnic or something, you want to repel mosquitoes. You want to keep them away. You might use insect repellent, some kind of chemical that you put on your skin or something like that to keep those bugs away.
Yes, and as you mentioned, Roger, he also underestimated the kind of support that Ukraine would get from around the world. And where there were some very separate nations in Europe before, I think the issue of the war in Ukraine actually unified a lot of the ideologies around Europe. In our article, it says that it consolidated the support from around the world. So consolidated means to bring together, unite. And of course, a lot of countries united in their joint efforts to support Ukraine.
Exactly. Consolidated, of course, that's from the verb to consolidate, which means you make something stronger or more solid. And indeed, we got lots of support for Ukraine from around the world when that happened. And even as the Russian army occupied territory in eastern Ukraine, illegally annexing several regions, Ukraine launched successful counteroffensives. So it is true that Russia did occupy territory in the eastern part of Ukraine. If you occupy a place, you're just there and you're in control. Like after World War II, of course, the United States did not conquer or invade Japan. They just simply occupied the place. They were there to make sure things were okay, and then they kind of let them do their own thing there. But in this case, the Russians occupied territory in eastern Ukraine, and they also did something bad. They illegally annexed several regions. Annexing here is from the verb to annex, which means to simply add something to your territory. That's what Russia did a while ago with the Crimean Peninsula. That's what Germany did in World War II when they annexed Austria, and then they invaded all the other countries around it. And of course, the invaders are the Russians, so you might think that the Ukrainians are just sitting back and taking it, but they were actually able to launch successful counteroffensives, which means you're fighting back after they have attacked you. And Russian troops suffered heavy losses and were humiliated in April by the sinking of the cruiser the Moskva. So if you're humiliated, people embarrass you. It's not supposed to happen to you. Russia's supposed to be this big, strong country, but still little Ukraine was able to sink one of Russia's big battleships, the Moskva, and that's what a cruiser is. It's just a large battleship.
Okay, and humiliated, of course, as Roger said, to be embarrassed, to allow someone to lose pride, to humble them. The Russians always pride themselves on being a really strong nation. Putin himself always prides himself on being a strong man. And so, of course, he felt very embarrassed because initially you'll remember that he thought he was going to win the war in only a few weeks.
Indeed. So he was humiliated. Russia was humiliated. I suppose you could say the Americans were humiliated after the defeat in Afghanistan and in Vietnam and various other places. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now to the third part, and we'll listen first.
With every defeat, Russia's leaders have resorted to increasingly extreme actions. In September, they announced a military draft that thousands of men left Russia to escape. In October, Ukraine's successful attack on an important bridge linking annexed Crimea with Russia led to a swift response in the form of strikes on cities and threats to use nuclear weapons. As the war rages on, it is anyone's guess how it will end. One can only hope that it will end as soon as possible.
第三部分我们看到名词 defeat， 指的是战败或是失利。举例来说 The players on the baseball team were very upset after their terrible defeat. 棒球队的球员在惨败后非常沮丧。或是 After its defeat in World War II, Germany was divided into two nations. 德国在二次大战战败后分裂成两个国家。另外，这个字也可以当作动词，意思是击败或是战胜。我们可以说 I defeated my brother in a game of chess. 我在一场西洋棋赛中击败我弟弟。也可以说 The brave knight defeated the dragon and brought peace to the village. 那位英勇的骑士击败了龙，并为村庄带来和平。最后我们看到片语 resort to 加名词或是动词 ing， 指的是诉诸或是采取……举例来说 I will only resort to surrender if I am given no other choice. 我只有在别无选择的情况下才会诉诸投降。或是 We'll have to resort to swimming if this boat continues to sink. 若船持续下沉，我们将得要靠游泳求生了。
Okay, so we're talking about things not going so well for Russia in Ukraine. Putin thought it would be over in just a couple of weeks. Ukraine would be a pushover. It'd be easy to conquer them. But they're suffering all these setbacks. So here in the final part, it says, with every defeat, Russia's leaders have resorted to increasingly extreme actions. A defeat is when you lose, okay? It can also be a verb. We could say the Lions defeated the Tigers by a score of 80-70 in the basketball game last night. To defeat as a verb. But here it is a defeat as a noun. With every loss or with every defeat, Russia's leaders are getting desperate. They're resorting to increasingly extreme actions. If you resort to something, that means you choose something else, especially when you're running out of options.
Yes, so to the Russians, it must have seemed like the last available action that they could take because they are running out of ideas because, as we mentioned before, the war or the special military operation isn't going Russia's way at the moment. In September, they announced a military draft that thousands of men left Russia to escape. So a draft, of course, is when you get called up to serve in the army. That happened in World War II. Some people enlisted voluntarily, but if you get drafted, it means that you have no choice. A lot of people also got drafted into the Vietnam War in America in the 1960s and 70s, which they also tried to avoid and which there were huge protests about. But in Russia, people also didn't want to join this military action. They didn't want to be a part of it. And so they tried to escape across the border. And so there were lots of news reports about people crossing borders into neighboring countries to avoid the draft.
Yep, like lots of Americans went up to Canada during the Vietnam War to avoid the draft. They did not want to fight in Vietnam. And in October, Ukraine's successful attack on an important bridge linking annexed Crimea with Russia led to a swift response in the form of strikes on cities and threats to use nuclear weapons. So Ukraine had a successful attack. I guess you could say it was a counter-offensive. They attacked an important bridge, and that bridge linked Crimea, which was annexed to Russia's territory, and that bridge linked Crimea with Russia. They destroyed that bridge or damaged it, and of course the Russians weren't happy about that, so that led to a swift response in the form of strikes on cities by, shooting missiles into major Ukrainian cities. And they also said, hey, if you guys keep doing that, we're going to nuke you. We're going to drop a big bomb on you 1,000 times worse than the one that was dropped in Hiroshima.
Yeah, that is a very serious threat. And the problem is that we're never quite sure if we should take Vladimir Putin seriously because he is rather unpredictable. But of course, if one side resorts to using nuclear weapons, that could spell disaster for the whole world. So of course, that is something that needs to be avoided at all costs.
Now, here in the final paragraph, it says, as the war rages on, as it continues in a violent fashion, it's anyone's guess how it will end. So to rage on again means to continue, like a storm can rage on if it lasts for several days. So nobody really knows. It's anyone's guess how it's going to end. Will Russia finally give up, or will they eventually take over Ukraine with the help of somebody else? Who knows? It's anyone's guess. One can only hope that it will end as soon as possible. Indeed, if a war ends earlier, then fewer people will be affected.
Yes, I'm looking forward to the end of the war in the Ukraine and, of course, world peace, aspiring to world peace, but there are just so many conflicts in the world, it's hard to keep track.
It is indeed, but hopefully this will end soon and other wars won't start in their place. Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. It's time now to listen to our Chinese teacher, Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny， 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文提到，普丁以为对乌克兰的入侵会在几周内成功完成。那么相反地，当乌克兰击退俄罗斯军队，并联合来自世界各地的支援时，他看到了乌克兰充分的决心。那课文第二部分，他就用到 repel 这个动词来表达击退。我们来学它的字首字根。好，看到字根P-E-L 它有 push 或是 drive 等等的意思，就是表达驱使、驱动或是推挤。那么在 repel 这个字当中，它的字首 R-E 表示 back 返回往回，那么字根 P-E-L 表示 drive 驱使，驱使攻击者或是敌人返回，把他们推回去，这样应该可以联想到 repel 有击退的意思。那顺便补充几个有相同字根的单字，第一个是 propel， 它的字首 P-R-O 表示 forward 就是向前，那么 P-E-L 表示驱使，合在一起 propel 就是推动、推进、驱策、驱动的意思。第二个补充的是 expel， 它的字首 ex 表示由内向外， pel 表示推挤，那么由内向外推挤应该很容易联想到 expel 它有驱逐啊、赶走、排出的意思。第三个补充的是 dispel， 它的字首 dis 表示分离， pel 表示驱使，那么合在一起 dispel 它就有驱散或是消除的意思。好，那同样在课文第二部分有一句写到 Ukraine launched successful counteroffensives， 乌克兰发动了成功的反击。那么 counteroffensive 就是指反攻或是反击，它是当名词来用。那它的字首 counter counter 这个部分表示相反的、对应的。这个字首呢，常常会接在其他字词的前面。我们就来看几个例子。第一个是 counteract， 好，它的字首 counter 就表示对立，后面加上 act act， 它有行动、作用的意思。那对立的行动应该可以联想到 counteract， 它表示抵消啊、抵抗或者是对抗。好，第二个例子是 counterpart， 它的字首 counter 表示相对应的， part 表示一方，那相对应的一方就是用来表达对应的人事物。counterpart 这个字常常用来指跟前面的叙述相对应的人或事物。假设我们前面的叙述可能有提到某部电影的女主角，那你接着就可以用 her male counterpart，对应的男性，那就是指男主角咯。好，那第三个补充的是 counterclockwise， 这个 clock 是时钟嘛， 那么后面加上 wise 这个副词字尾，表示以什么样的方式，把这两部分结合在一起 clockwise 就表示顺时针方向的。然后我们在 clockwise 前面加上字首 counter 是相反的，那顺时针的相反就是逆时针咯，所以 counterclockwise 就表示逆时针方向的。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Invade. The army invaded the town in a surprise attack. Conquer. The Romans conquered Carthage, destroying the city during the Third Punic War. Determination. While she isn't the best athlete, Barbara often wins her tennis matches through her extreme determination. Repel. The cat repelled the bear's attack by scratching it on the nose. Occupy. The foreign troops occupied the countryside while the native troops held the urban areas. Humiliate. Ron was humiliated by the trick his friends played on him. Defeat. After suffering another defeat, Ronald gave up playing badminton for good.
Discussion starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today, and the question is, do you believe that Ukraine will succeed in defeating the Russian invasion? Why or why not?
I think Ukraine will succeed in defeating the Russian invasion since the Ukrainian president has already managed to consolidate international support and the Ukrainian army has already taken back her son.
Well, I'm more pessimistic. I think Ukraine will fail to defeat the Russian invasion because Russia is just so big. And of course, Russia can call back all its hockey players that are playing in the NHL in North America and enlist them in the army. And if those guys have rifles, it will be only a couple of days before Ukraine falls. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program. And please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I'm Candice.
See you next time.